Okay.
Welcome everyone to live at lunchtime here on this second Thursday of the month at noon. And as always, as our recent tradition is, I'm here with Father Dan Subicki. How you doing, Dan? How are things
Pretty
in
good.
Alden and Corfu and East Pembroke and
Been a busy day,
yeah,
and we're recording on Veterans Day as well. So,
that's right,
prayers for veterans out there.
that's right. Yeah, uh, thanks for mentioning that, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
My kids are home from school today, and we put our American flag out in front of the house, and Esther's,
Yeah,
excited about Veterans Day.
I
She's hearing a
knew
lot
that the
about at
kids were
school.
off yesterday, but I got up this morning and I was like, school mass, the school mass. I gotta get ready for the school mass. And I go over and I'm like setting everything up for the school mass, and somebody's like, Father, it's they're not here today.
There's no school. Oops.
Right. So,
The liturgical calendar you've got memorized. It's
yeah,
the civic calendar, right?
doesn't
That
always
you
line up
posted
together.
on the wall or something.
And that's a funny
So
discussion sometimes in an office setting, whether it's like, oh, it's a church day, do I get that off? Or it's a civic day, do I get that off? Do I get them all
yeah,
off? How does that line up? So,
that's funny. So speaking of having the church calendar memorized, right before we got on the live stream here, we realized that the lectionary, which I mean is a component of the church calendar, is different for us today. So when we were kind of preparing for this,
yeah.
we said to each other, "Hey, let's do the Mark 13, the gospel reading."
And I'm
And
like,
it
yeah,
turns
like
out,
Mark 13,
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
I
sure,
got
right,
that right
yeah.
here.
Turns out it's not the same reading from Mark 13 for both of us. I have verses 1 through 8, and you have the end of the chapter, I think is what you said.
Yeah. As we talk about the end of things,
Right.
so that's we can still have a good discussion on this. I think maybe if we each read our sections from our own versions.
Sure.
So I'll try to follow. I definitely have yours here. You start at verse 1, was it,
Yeah.
of
Yep.
Mark 13?
Uh, 1 through 8. Yeah, so that's a good idea. So why don't I read verses 1 through 8, and then you can read your verses from later in the chapter then. So
Okay.
here's Mark 13, 1 through 8. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." And then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that these things are about to be accomplished?" And then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And then there will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. And this is but the beginning of the birth pangs." So that's verses 1 through 8.
Okay. So the headers for the next few sections, it talks about a coming persecution and a great
Mm-hmm.
tribulation. And then we go all the way down to the coming of the Son of Man. So this is Mark chapter 3, verses 24 to 32. Jesus said to his disciples, "In those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the end of the earth to the end of the sky." Learn a lesson from the fig tree. When its branch becomes tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see these things happening, know that he is near at the gates. Amen, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. The Gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. I'm not sure if that's the correct response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just
Okay.
realized
Okay.
right
Okay.
there. Like, wait a minute. No, it's just my
Uh,
habits kicking in. From my
yeah.
own
Yeah.
tradition. So, prophecy, apocalypse,
Yeah.
temple. There's a lot to unpack here.
So this is interesting. So like my the first place my mind goes is to like how these kinds of things were interpreted to me when I was like a kid.
Mine too. I had the same
In like
reaction. Yeah.
in like the tradition I grew up in, right? There was this the technical term that was used for this kind of like theological lens was like premillennial dispensationalism. That
Whoa.
this
Okay. Wait. Premillennial dispensationalism.
so that's a lot to unpack, but
Yeah.
if maybe just to define those words at least premillennialism. So millennialism comes from a reference in the book of Revelation
Okay.
to uh, Christ reigning for 1,000 years, right? A millennium.
All right.
Um,
So it's not like
and
you and me here, where we're like old millennials or whatever they call us.
right,
I
right,
can't
right.
remember.
Pre-millennial.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is pre-80s, 1980s people. No, this is a reference to this like 1,000 year reign of Christ, which again in some some church contexts is taken to be like more or less literal, right? Um,
Is this something that
but
is anticipated, or was this like Constantine, or like what's this 1,000 year period that we're looking at here?
so that's where pre-millennialism comes into this. So
Okay.
there's a couple. So to differentiate that, there's what you might call like post-millennialism, and then there's also a or millennialism. I would say like most of church history, like including well established church fathers like Augustine and others were millennialists, right? That that this is a like sort of figurative way of talking about like Christ reigning, like ruling in
Right.
the kingdom of God through the Holy Spirit in us, the church on the earth, right? So like it's figurative, or at least it's it has a non-literal meaning,
Mm-hmm.
like 1,000 years of reigning. So that's one way of looking at it, which again tends to be like most of church history. But then post-millennialism is more or less like the view of a lot of oh the I would say like 19th and 20th century American theology, this idea that no, this actually is referring to a somewhat like literal reign of Christ on the earth, but it will take place through the church. And what that means is Christ like has like begun to rule, and we are living sort of after that beginning, and it is our job as the church to usher in the sort of consummation of that kingdom arriving. So in other words, it's this idea of almost like Christian perfectionism, that like we can build a the age of optimism, right? Like we can
Okay.
build so perfect of a society, a Christian society, that it becomes like the ideal that God like wants for us and has wanted for us. So like that's post millennialism.
On earth as it is in
Premillennialism
heaven,
is
sort of
that
like. Okay. All right.
yeah, exactly. So premillennialism is this idea that um, we're waiting for this 1,000 year reign of Jesus to begin. That's why we are pre the millennium.
Mm-hmm.
And so when does it begin? It begins after a series of events take place that are like fairly like specifically prescribed in this theological understanding.
Tribulations.
Exactly
Yeah.
right. So if you've ever heard of the books, the Left Behind series, or like the Nicolas
Yep.
Cage was in
Yep.
the more recent Left Behind movie. That is premillennial dispensationalist theology.
Yep.
That that we're waiting for Jesus to return, and when Jesus returns, then it's going to like trigger this like series of events which we can read very specifically about in like the book of Daniel
Hmm.
and the book of Revelation to some extent, passages like Mark chapter 13 that that talk about this like period of tribulation which is going to last like a literal 7 years. And then even within this like 7 years, there's some disagreement among dispensationalists about, well, does Jesus return to the earth at the beginning of the 7 years, at the end of the 7 years, or in the middle of the 7 years? In other words, the question is the tribulation's coming, and it's going to be like God's wrath poured out on all of the earth. And the question is, does the church endure that or not? And so if people say, like, nope, they don't, then they would say Jesus returns at the beginning of the tribulation, and it's all of the heathens, right, who endure the wrath of God.
Okay.
Uh, and then other people would say, no, 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 the church is going to be a part of this, and it's going to be like this is going to be like a sifting out of the like wheat from the chaff in the church.
Hmm.
And so Jesus returns at the end of it, and like the remnant, the true faithful, will be identified at that point, having endured through the tribulation. And then some people would say, no, I think God's going to have mercy on us halfway through, and it's going to take place right in the middle of it. So that I guess that's what I mean by when I think about these kinds of passages. I go back to how I understood this as a kid, which was like through the lens of the Left Behind series, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
I thought that's literally how things were going to happen, and I think some people still think that. I don't happen to think that anymore, but that's
So
how it's hard to
in
escape that way of
in
thinking
a
since I'm a
Catholic
kid.
church, I would say you do see a lot of overlap with that with some people, um, and I think part of what drives it is this. If I could, like a particular personality, like people are drawn to this sense of like they found some great secret, they found this like key to the universe in a text or a vision or something like that, and because of that, they can foresee some absolutely awful disaster coming that nobody else sees, but they've also found a way to survive that disaster. And
Hmm.
so it's sometimes very literally what you're talking about, but for us, it will often be people that are connected to different visionaries or somebody. They talk to Mary, they talk to Jesus, they got warnings
Hmm.
about this. Some of those visions are approved by the church, but the further away you get from that approval, the weirder the stuff gets, and it often becomes apocalyptic, and
Hmm.
and and so when I'm dealing with people that are in that, I kind of have to like rewind a little bit because not all prophecy is apocalyptic, and it's important to talk about what prophecy means in the Bible.
Hmm.
As I was searching here at the side, I couldn't remember who had originally started the phrase "already" and "not yet" for
Hmm.
you know uh, kingdom theology, I guess, and apparently it
Yeah,
was Gerhardus Voss, I guess, was the
that
quote.
sounds
So
that sounds that sounds yeah.
okay.
A 19th century German
Okay.
theologian's name, right? That
All
sounds
right,
that sounds
yeah,
about right.
it's legit. I mean, it's I certainly caught on and hear it in preaching and in writing and so forth. So, it, prophecy has a sense, I think, in which it happened. This is what I was taught in seminary, as sort of a definitive historical thing. Today we're talking about the destruction of the temple, like which is an event that happened in 70 A.D. and we know it happened, and you can visit that place today and say, "Yep, temple got destroyed."
There it was. Yep.
There it was. It was a very traumatic thing, and people couldn't imagine how can I even relate to God without the temple? What does this mean? Has He abandoned us completely? Is this a final definitive break? Um, so it was like the end of the world. The Romans crushing everything they held dear. But then there's a sense in which it's sort of like we find meaning in that going forward. It's not just a piece of history like that happened a long time ago. You say, well, we find ourselves in similar places at different times. As we lose our own church or we see a building closing or something like
Hmm.
that, and you say, well, it's not as traumatic, but our own trauma maybe connects with that trauma they experienced so long ago. So, um, another truism, I guess, is that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Hmm.
That there's you see similar things happen over and over again, and so these writings have a lot of meaning for us. And then I think sometimes there is that hint of apocalypse, that maybe
Hmm.
these do happen in some final way at some point, and that's where the debate really gets kind of
Hmm.
heated. Um, but I don't want to limit this only to that, to say that this
Hmm.
only has value for something that will happen tomorrow or the next day, in that final sense. There's other meanings of prophecy that are really worth diving into.
Yeah, that's that. I think you kind of summarized a lot of that conversation around like prophecy and apocalyptic prophecy pretty like well. That was really good.
Well, thank you.
I I think about sometimes, um, we think of so I have two thoughts. Let me start with this first thought.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I came across this phrase, in my education, which has always been like really helpful for me, that like the majority of prophecy in the Bible is like we tend to think of prophecy sort of colloquially as like foretelling, right? Like going to a
Right.
tarot card reader or something that's going to
Yeah,
tell your
yeah.
future, right?
What are the
Like
lottery
that's
numbers tomorrow? Like.
right, like that's what's the horoscope saying about like what today or my near future is going to hold. But like 90% of prophecy in scripture is not foretelling, it's forthtelling, right? Uh
Hmm.
it's like the prophets like functioned like covenant enforcers, right? So
Hmm.
you have this covenant,
Mm-hmm.
and for Jews in the first century, I mean for Jews today, right? For that matter, there's an element of you know of the law and of tradition that's a part of of the covenant. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is what like God has said you ought to do. What the prophets would do, they wouldn't come along and say something's going to happen 50 years from now. They would say, like, you guys, God already told you what to do and you're not doing it, right?
Yeah.
Like they
Yep.
were they were
Yep.
enforcing the covenant. They were
Yeah.
saying you're not upholding your end of this agreement that you have with God. And that's like 90% of what they're doing. They're not telling the future.
Yeah.
They're forth telling a message from God about what they ought to be doing based on what's already been established. And sometimes, and this is like maybe where the 10% of prophecy kind of comes in, that is maybe foretelling, where uh the prophets would say, and because you haven't been doing that, this is going to happen, right? or
Yeah.
or this is happening currently, but just like hold on, because God will rescue you out of this, sometime, and here will be a sign for you, what you can look for,
Yeah.
and
And
that will take place.
I think also it's sometimes hard to separate what is directly divine action and what is just the natural consequences of their actions. It's like,
Yeah.
guys, if you don't pay your workers a fair wage, they're going to be upset and it's not going to go well for you. You don't need God to step in to make that happen. But other times
Hmm.
there is more of a warning that God will intervene and God will set things right, or God will chastise, or something like that. But I think typically with the hope that there's some change that people could make in the present moment that would avert the disaster, or set things right. There's this is if we skipped all the way ahead to Revelations. I mean, you could read some pretty scary things in Revelations, but if you sit down and read the whole thing in one setting, most of it is a message of hope that
Yeah.
God will still be with you through all of these tribulations, and that the church will ultimately triumph.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point, I think, when it like relates specifically to this kind of literature, because if you get too myopic of a view and you
Mm.
just like really zero in on, oh my gosh, like what is Jesus talking about? About this like olive tree and its leaves and all of these things taking place,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, but if you read it within its context, or like you're saying, if you read Revelation in a setting, in a
Mm-hmm.
sitting, you can kind of get more of that context, which is important because I think in this case, um, Mark 13, I mean, I think what Jesus is trying to indicate, like really the point has to do with starting with this idea of the temple, right? Like the disciples are like, whoa, like look at look at the size of these stones that this temple's built with. Isn't this like
Mm-hmm.
amazing? This is like the pinnacle of our like religious aspirations, isn't it? Like this is what everything is all about. And
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is saying, "Are you kidding me?
Mm-hmm.
Like you think this building is the reason that like
Yeah.
God's made a covenant with you? Like are you kidding me? No,
Yeah.
like this building's not going to be here forever.
Mm-hmm.
And and you know what? It's going to feel like the whole world is like crumbling underneath you when goes away, but that doesn't change the like reality or the grounds on which your covenant with God is based, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like he's I think it has to do with uh it's like dramatic and extreme language. I'm not trying
Mm-hmm.
to say, Jesus is just like totally being figurative here,
Well, we know
but
that
I'm
he
just
uses
saying
hyperbole at times, to
sure,
make a point.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think he's saying like, yeah, like this, like it's going to be a big deal. And it was like 70 was a huge deal. 70 AD was a huge deal. It's going to be a big deal. It's going to change everything.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? Like, like you're still in good hands. Like
Yeah.
God is still with you.
Yep.
And I think that's the point. But
Yeah.
if we get too like zeroed in on, oh my gosh, like what specifically could Jesus have meant about, you know, uh
Yeah. The future.
these things, taking
Yeah.
place, wars and rumors of wars. And I think I think that's an important part of trying to
So
understand what all of
I
this
like
means.
when we talk about like past, present, and future. I really like to emphasize in this section, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. That's something that he said in a historical moment to real people who actually died and are no longer with us. You can't say hi to Peter. Like, I mean, you can go visit where we think he may have been buried, but like, I
Yeah.
mean, like, they're dead. This prophecy happened. This is a historical event. Like, the temple was actually destroyed. So,
Hmm.
you want to be really careful, like expanding this from that to say,
Hmm.
well, it's he's actually talking about something in the future. Like, well, this bit came true. This generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. So there is some sense in which this whole process of like the temple being destroyed, all these world-shattering things happening, and then Jesus coming to collect these faithful ones, these apostles whom he's talking to, that already happened. We're past that point now. And then, so then it becomes a question of, in what sense is this a pattern that repeats?
Hmm.
Because I think it does. We do celebrate. We experience loss. We experience suffering and difficulties, but great joys as well. And we know that Christ will come and take us home as well. I mean, how many times have you and I done readings at funerals that talk about us being
Hmm.
taken up? So it's a little bit of both. Like it's a historical thing, but it's also a process that we're experiencing even right now.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And I think to some extent too, um, I like how I've heard like um, this type of prophetic language that Jesus is using. We call it like apocalyptic.
Mm-hmm.
Like we think of like talking about apocalyptic literature as a genre of literature.
Hmm.
We think sometimes of an apocalypse kind of
Yeah.
like the Walking Dead, or
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that
Yes.
like what that means is like, oh, an apocalypse is like something in the future that describes the end of the world,
Mhm.
and not that's unfortunate because not all of apocalyptic literature in like scripture as a genre is necessarily about that. I've heard it defined as what an apocalypse means, because like that Greek word apocalypso, it really just means like to reveal, or a revelation, and like
Hmm.
that that's like what tends to happen here usually. um like if you read in the book of Revelation, let's say, John of Patmos receives like he sees a vision, and it's a there's like an angelic messenger, right?
Hmm.
Who is like really kind of, think of it almost as like peeling back the heavens so that he gets to see behind the
Yeah.
curtain in a
Yep.
way. He's revealing something. The angel is revealing something to John that John wouldn't otherwise have known had the revelation not happened. And,
Hmm.
and I think why that's important is because this kind of literature is actually supposed to be encouraging to the one to whom it's revealed, right? It's
Yes.
like you're going through a hard time. Mark 13 is talking about like the destruction of the temple that's coming,
Hmm.
and what Jesus in this case is doing, and what the angel is doing for John in Revelation, is sort of pulling the curtain back a little bit to say, like, guys, like, look, just like look here, like there is like a cosmic, you know, like uproar happening, but you know what? Like God's still in charge, and like God is going to see this thing through. And I think when I'm entertaining the question that you asked about what does this kind of thing that's already happened for the Peters of scripture,
Hmm.
70 came and went, and like it was traumatic, and like changed the world and everything they knew. What does that look like in our lives? I think I think sometimes it, like, for me at least, helps me to think, gosh, if only I could have that that experience. Like if I could just see behind the curtain of
Hmm.
like what's happening right now in the world
Hmm.
from like God's point of view,
Hmm.
it would probably be crazy, just like
Hmm.
it is for Revelation and Mark 13. But I would also see that, you know what, God's in control, God is in
Yeah.
charge, God will see this thing through, and like that's an encouraging thought to me, to know that despite all of these like chaotic powers of darkness that are at work, like dude, God has got this, right? Like that I think is a really encouraging thing to kind of come away with when reading a passage like this. For me, it is, at least. I
Yeah.
I like that.
The other kind of side to that, and I think this is one of the reasons we talk about of that day or hour nobody knows, is
Mm,
for a bunch. We talk about sort of like doomsday cults and things in history. There's a reaction sometimes as you look at the history of different religious movements. People say, oh, the world is going to end on, 1863, on like such and such a day, whatever it is. And what happens? They just stop working. It's
mm,
like, why bother doing anything else? I'm not going to have children because they're not going to grow up. I'm just going to sit on my porch. Like, why even bother planting? Because I'm not going to get to harvest. There's this sort of radical passivity that sets in. Um, and that's probably one of the like it's very practical. Like if you did know the future like that, their actions make sense. They've all been wrong up to this point, and I think one of the things is one of the reasons that the Father doesn't reveal. He says, but of that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Um, we're meant to hear these things and to be encouraged, but also to say, like, okay, I don't have to give up. Like, I don't have to sit on my porch and wait for God to fix things. Like, he'll take care of the cosmic stuff. The world's going to keep turning. I have work to do. I have children to raise. I have crops to plant. Like, it's supposed it's not supposed to be an excuse to just kind of opt out of everything that's happening down here and wait for God to fix it. I think
mm.
that's one of the dangers of that one way of apocalyptic thinking.
I had a roommate once, um, who probably would have like viewed the theology that we're talking about here the way you're describing it.
Mm-hmm.
And when we first moved in together, I said to him something like, "Hey, we should probably, uh, find like a workable system in the space of our, 2-bedroom apartment to like collect our recyclables and,
Sure.
take care of our recyclables." And he was just like, "Oh, I don't recycle." And I was like, "Oh, okay, why not?" And he's like, "Because as far as I'm concerned, all of this is gonna burn someday anyway. So
Yeah. Yep.
like what's the point?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, but and then to your point, it's like, but what if that's not for like, I don't know, thousands more
Yeah.
years, right?
Yep.
Like between now and then, there's a lot of things that are in our control, right? That we
And the idea of
can
being a
be
custodian, that
respectful
you're
and good
responsible
stewards of.
for it. He's going to come up and he's going to say, thanks for taking care of my garden. What are all these pop cans doing here?
We have a responsibility. We have a job here to take care of things. So it's Pope Francis in particular has really emphasized environmentalism. He's very worried about how we're taking care of the world, and in particular, there's a lot of knock-on effects from environmental damage. Those that are least able to take care of themselves are the poor. So they're the ones that don't have fresh water to drink and or healthy food, places to plant their crops.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of reasons that tie into that. But yeah, I don't mean to be like banging my drum about works again. We've certainly had that discussion before. The
Sure, no, that's great.
Our discussions, but I think we do have we have been left entrusted with this world, and again and again we hear in the scriptures when Jesus talks about the master returning to look at the vineyard. He wants to know, what were you guys up to while I was gone?
What do you do with this? Yeah, so this is maybe getting off topic slightly, but I think I can bring it back. So, I've heard that kind of thinking, like my roommate, this is all gonna burn. It's sort of based in this, another sort of theological subcategory called like Dominionism, which is based in like what is said
That's the
in,
name for it.
in
That's what I was kind of trying to think of. Mm-hmm.
Genesis 1, right, where like God makes humanity and says, "Have dominion over the fish, the sea, the birds of the air, everything that creeps on the earth."
But it's more like all this stuff has to serve me. That's like what their interpretation of dominion is, right?
Yeah, it's like dominion. It's like, this is my, like, God gave this to me, and so I get to use it as I see fit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Except it's like, I think that's a very specific theological interpretation of what that passage in Genesis 1 even means.
Convenient. It's a very convenient interpretation.
Oh, sure, right, sure. I think what is more likely happening there is, especially if you see Genesis 1 as almost this like, there's lots of temple metaphors that are that are being used to describe like creation as God's temple and we as God's image, like we are the bearers of God's image, the representation, like, since God has no like graven images, we are God's representation in this temple that God resides in and is worshipped in, right? And I think it's like, thinking through that lens, it's sort of as if God said, "Hey, this is my temple. Would you guys please take care of it?"
Yeah.
Or maybe just to like change the metaphor slightly, it's kind of like God says, "Hey, do you mind like house sitting for me and taking care of my stuff while I'm gone?" And then it's like, if God comes back and sees that we've just like totally disregarded the couches and the TV and like everything is damaged, like I think God would probably wonder, like, what did you do to my house, guys? It's like, what, you said that you gave this to us, yeah, but it's like still mine, like this is mine, like I asked you to take care of it, I didn't ask you to destroy it. and that's a very different kind of perspective that this serves me.
And we think about the way that Jesus, that the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great ones make their authority over them felt, but it must not be so among you, the greatest, and the least. So there's this need to serve that Jesus is constantly challenging his own disciples in terms of that lordly thinking, and it's clear that he doesn't do that. He's not that kind of domineering king. And so it's particularly weird to me that someone would look at the way that Jesus lived the Hebrew Scriptures and say, like, no, I'm just going to skip that and just go with my own interpretation.
Yeah, right, yeah, that right. There's some intentional, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like selective hearing or something there,
Yeah. Cherry picking. It's cafeteria Catholic is what we would sometimes say in our tradition for folks that like this teaching but don't like that teaching. So
that's great. Cafeteria Catholic. I like it.
Yeah.
So anything else about this passage, Dan, that stands out to you? Or have we?
Oh gosh, time is flying. I guess as we had longer sections to look at. No, I don't think that anything else really did. I think anytime I think about prophecy for myself, I think past, present, and future. How was this true? How is this true? How might it be true in the future? And I kind of talked about that. But I also really, I'm really glad you mentioned, because I try to keep that in mind as well. Like you say, about 90% of prophecy is a challenge to live what you've been asked to do in the present moment. And that's why I'm really nervous about any interpretation that has you, putting up your feet on the porch and, abandoning your kids or whatever, because, God's coming any minute. And like, well,
yeah.
That's not usually what a prophet would be asking you to do.
Right. Yeah. Like, be watchful, right? That's what Jesus says. Like, hey, like, don't get caught with your feet up. Get caught, like, doing the work, because there's work to be done. That's great. Well, this has been fun. Not a common kind of conversation for us, right? To be talking about the
no, but an important one.
Absolutely.
I think people worry about prophecy, and it's an important thing to get right.
Absolutely. Yep. All right. Well, Dan, thanks for being here. Thanks everyone for tuning in if you are, or for watching the archived live stream later if you're doing that. If you have any questions, as always, put them in the comment section, and we'll get to those afterward. So, Dan, thanks again, and I guess we'll be back again in December. Advent will be in full swing.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to talk about that. So, yeah, looking forward to it.
Maybe there will be some sort of Advent specific types of conversations we can have on that particular one. So
incarnational theology, that'll be
good.
That'll be good.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, and see you next time.
All right.